Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. I am Sylvia Weisberg, President-elect of the International Communication Association. First, I would like to welcome everyone to our conference. I'm delighted to see you all here. More than 3,500 members are participating in annual conference in Gold Coast, Australia. Including more than 200 people who are currently watching the proceedings. As probably some of you know, coming to Gold Coast has been in the planning for a while, 11 years to be more precise. We are so happy, finally, we made it here. Thank you for everybody who was responsible for bringing us here. Next, I would like to acknowledge the work of the fabulous ICA staff. As anyone who has volunteered to work for ICA knows, it's pretty remarkable the work that the ICA staff headquarters does. Since I joined ICA many decades ago, that will be many decades ago, I wonder often how ICA works so well. And having worked with the staff and the executive committee for the last year and a half, I know that one of the secrets is the dedication and the experience of the staff. Members, you will be shocked to learn that this entire conference and everything else we do at ICA is managed just by 7 people. Let me recognize them. Member Services Coordinator Carly Senesak, Manager of Member Services Bradley Brewer, who probably is manning the registration desk right now. Meetings and Events Manager Christopher Rochette, who is responsible for the AV and catering. Manager of Conference and Exhibit Services Katie Wolf. Director of Governance and Member Services Julie Arnold. Director of Conferences Services Jennifer Lay. Associate Executive Director and Senior Director of Publications Tom Mankowski. And Laura Sawyer, our Executive Director. So thank you all for ensuring we do a great job. Thank you, thank you. Next, I would like to underscore the significance of holding the conference in Australia in the context of ongoing efforts for globalization and inclusion at ICA. As Volker Turk, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, has recently stated, the world's oldest continuing culture calls this land home. So too do millions of other Australians who identified with over 300 different ancestries. Nearly 1/3 of Australians were born overseas. More than 1 in 5 Australians speak a language other than English at home. As the program of this conference shows, ICA is strongly committed to further globalize everything that we do. This requires engaging and recognizing scholars and research worldwide, fostering dialogue and collaboration, reflecting our analytical premises, and learning from, acknowledging, and elevating one another. We're on this endeavor together. We welcome suggestions and insights on how to continue making ICA a more globalized and inclusive association. Next, I would like to turn it over to Laura Sawyer, ICA's Executive Director. Laura?
Good morning where you are if you're watching remotely. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this year's conference. As is customary, I'm honored to formally begin today's proceedings with a land acknowledgement. I respectfully acknowledge the land, the waters, the people, and the traditional families of the Yugambeh region, the traditional owners of the land on which we meet. As is right and just, we have asked the traditional custodians for their permission to be here on their land. I am so grateful to Uncle John Graham for being with us here today to welcome us to country. John is a traditional custodian of the Gold Coast region, a Kombumerri man, and a saltwater man of the Gold Coast part of the wider Yugambeh language group. John is a very respected figure within the Southeast Queensland region and is relied upon for his unique skill set, including cultural expertise, advocacy, stewardship, education, and conservation. John is an exemplary leader, role model, and advocate for the First Peoples of Australia, and is elder in residence at the Institute of Teaching and Learning Innovation at the University of Queensland. Please join me in welcoming Uncle John Graham.
Thanks very much for that introduction, and welcome everyone. It's really important. Everyone's beaming, ready to get into the conferences, and the conversations with all the guest speakers here tonight will be enthralling, because I will say it, my auntie's sitting up there, Dr. Graham. She'll be, and I must pay respects to her and any other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people in the audience. But you know, Gold Coast, beautiful one day, perfect the next. We say that to our southern counterparts coming from Hobart and Melbourne and Canberra and Sydney, so and also in the west in Perth and Adelaide. It's very cold down there, so we've got beautiful weather up here at the moment, so enjoy it. Bagel Yungai, Jimbalungus, g'day friends. My name's John Graham, proud Kumba man, saltwater man of the Gold Coast region. Our people are part of the Wadi Yugambeh language group, whose land stretch from the Logan River in the north, the Tweed River in the south, to the other side of the Great Dividing Range, out past Bow Desert, up to a place called Teviot Brook in the north, bordered by the beautiful Pacific Ocean. Kumba land stretched from the Goomera, the Coomera River in the north, down to the Tweed and to the foothills of the mountains. As it all welcomes, I'd like to acknowledge and pay my respects to elders, past, present and emerging, because it was old people that fought the good fight in dark and desperate times, in order for people of our generation to work with other Australians towards a reconciled nation, in order for us to leave a legacy for our young people. For they are the bearers of the flame, keepers of the knowledge, and keep our culture strong into the future. I pay my respects to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people across this nation, and I pay my respects to the spirit of this land and her people, which includes all of you here tonight, and welcome to everyone from overseas. It's a pleasure to have you here. My authority to speak comes through Waru, my apical ancestor, who grew up on the banks of the Logan Narang River, Naringwal, place of the shovel-nosed ray. In a later life, she came and lived with the daughter Jenny and husband Andrew, who were the river masters, the river pilots of the mighty Narang River, long before all the canal estates were developed, long before all the skyscrapers were built. Lived on a small island called Gardner Island, just off Brighton Parade, down from the Southport Bridge. Our people were sustained by the abundance of seafood from both the river and the ocean, and also the land. Our footprint remains strong in this built environment because our sovereignty was never ceded. We are and always will be the traditional custodians of this place. I say custodians, others say owners, and that's their prerogative. But I believe that Mother Earth has sustained us for eons of time, and we as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people have always given back. It's a message you give to small groups, a message you give to large groups. It's a message about sustainability. Economic sustainability is important. Environmental sustainability is the big thing. So, because right across the world, Mother Earth and nature is struggling. And we as stewards of country, yes, we're all stewards of country in Australia, but also in your own countries. You're stewards of countries. Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people will always be the original stewards of country into millennia, but everyone has a part to play in looking after country and place. And when I talk about country, country isn't just the land that we walk on. Country is the air, the ancestors, the spirits, oceans, rivers, creeks, lakes, plains, hills, mountains, deserts, forests, fauna and flora, and us, humans. We need to make sure we look after Mother Earth and country so the future generations can come and enjoy the same pristine beauties that we've had. It's important. That's the message I give to you tonight. And take it back with your own countries, because it's important that we stand up as influencers in our own communities to make sure we look after country. I've had the pleasure of welcoming you here tonight. I ask you several things. Respect this place, respect the fauna and flora, respect each other, and most importantly, respect yourselves. Until we meet again, Anyabu, Anyabu. Look after yourselves and be safe. Thank you. Bagel Yungai Jimbalungs. G'day friends. My name's John Graham. I'm a proud Kumba man, a saltwater man of the Gold Coast region. Our people are part of the Wadi Yugambeh language group. I'd like firstly to acknowledge and pay my respects to my elders past, present and emerging, as well as to the spirit of this land and her people, which includes all of you. I would also like to recognise the significance of this place, Darrigal, our dreaming mountain, which it holds for our people and to our neighbouring communities across the region.
Connection to the land means my spirit, my stories, the way I feel. It just fulfills me again.
Culture is life. You know, to have ancient blood running through your veins.
There was a time when our people couldn't practice culture. Now that we are able to freely share this, it gives me more motivation to want to do that and pass that on.
We have a connection to this land that goes back thousands of years, and it's really, really special to know that we are still here.
For me, Aboriginal culture is conservation, and conservation is Aboriginal culture. And that's a beautiful thing.
Growing up, I was very privileged to have my grandfather teach us from a very young age. I need to carry that on for him.
Just like everyone goes to church, well, our church is from the stars, the sun, the moon, the skies, the mountains, the creeks, the forest, all the animals, the rivers and the ocean. So that's the Yugamir connection with all this land.
Or we call this place Jalagal.
That's like a living monument of our history, our beliefs.
It was formed a long, long time ago when Jabreen, the creation spirit, stretched as he woke. His giant rocky fingers can still be seen protruding from the top of the headland, reaching up to the sky.
It's very significant to our people, and it means a lot to everyone that lives in the community.
The whole area is sacred, but there's specific sites on it that are quite significant to our mob.
It's a sanctuary and it's a place for people to come meditate, retreat, but also for what keeps us alive, the wildlife.
As soon as you enter the national park, it's almost like you're escaping reality. Everything's left on the other side of the swing gate.
It's not just the beauty that you see with the eye, it's more of a spiritual connection.
Even newcomers come. They feel the strength and the peace. That is precious to us. It's a sacred ground, sacred place. So we got to keep that.
This is the oldest continent in the world with the oldest living culture. I think that people love learning from that. And as generations move on, I think that we're questioning things like the impulse to destroy. We're questioning what the future looks like for our children and our children's children. And all of those things, Aboriginal people held the key to for 50,000 years.
What more beautiful and noble thing than is preserving what preserves us. Our wildlife is much green space as we can afford them. You know, they haven't got too much left, we've got to look after it.
I have 2 children right now. If I can give them this culture and just put it there for them from a young age, like there'll come a time when they know as much as I do, and I'll still be learning, and then we'll be learning together.
I find that I like to express more with them what culture means to me. They're the little people within our community, but they're our next up-and-coming generation. They're going to be the voice for us as well. They're going to help us all walk as one.
The Aboriginal history that we have of this land, I think that it's not just for our Indigenous people to be proud of, I think it's for all Australians to be proud of, no matter where you come from.
I just feel my connection to the land is to be here, to look after it, to speak for it, to care for it.
It makes me prouder because I'm letting that passion out and helping people and teaching people. And hopefully their mindset will change.
The different stories that we have here and the significance of the mountain and how we need to protect it. If we don't share that kind of messaging and those values, then we don't know what's going to happen in the future.
When you come to Geligal, the biggest thing you do is tread lightly, walk gently, keep to the paths, but please enjoy it because it's there to be enjoyed by everyone.
In our language, we say Bago, Yungai, Balalaya, wishing you a good journey until we meet again. Naya Nanyabu.
Thank you so much again, John, he has to run off to another event, but we're very grateful to him for being here to welcome us to country. And on behalf of our attendees who've traveled from 87 different countries to attend this conference on this land, I thank John and other Aboriginal people, past, present, and future, for welcoming us to this land. We do not take lightly the privilege that is extended by your welcome. We also wish to pay our respects to all of the Indigenous peoples of this and other lands who join us today and who continue to engage with us as part of the larger ICA community. So once again, thank you all. It is now my pleasure to officially open the 74th Annual Conference of the International Communication Association, Communication and Global Human Rights. So, now to the academic portion of our evening, our opening plenary, a conversation about communication and human rights in Australia and the world. Please be aware that this session is being streamed to hundreds of remote attendees who are joining us remotely, including our 9 hubs in China, Egypt, India, Kenya, Pakistan, and 2 each in both Indonesia and Nigeria. For this plenary session, we are honored to be joined by 3 esteemed scholars whose work focuses on human rights issues in Australia and indeed the rest of the world. Dr. Mary Graham grew up in southeast Queensland and is a Kombumerri person through her father's heritage and Waka Waka clan through her mother's heritage. With a career spanning more than 30 years, Dr. Graham is a dedicated lecturer with the University of Queensland, teaching Aboriginal history, politics, and comparative philosophy. Dr. Rosalind Croucher is the president of the Australian Human Rights Commission, a position she has held since 2017. An emeritus professor, she was president of the Australian Law Reform Commission and the former dean of law at both Macquarie University and Sydney University. During her 25 years in academia, Dr. Croucher has lectured and published extensively in the fields of equity, trusts, property, inheritance, and legal history. Dr. Libby Lester is professor and director of the Monash University Climate Change Communications Hub. Until recently, she was at the University of Tasmania, where she was the UNESCO chair in Communication, Environment, and Heritage, and director of the Institute for Social Change. For more than a decade, she herself worked as a journalist, reporting on social, political, and environmental issues for major Australian newspapers and magazines. Professor Lester's work is focused on understanding and promoting the role of communication and media in good decision-making about shared social and environmental futures. Many thanks to the three of you for joining us. You may now come to the stage, please, if you haven't already started up. And as they come to the stage, it is now my immense pleasure to introduce the chair of this evening's session. You may know him, professor of the School of Media and Public Affairs at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., USA, an ICA fellow, the planner for this year's conference, and in a matter of days, the soon-to-be ICA president, Dr. Silvio Wastebord.
Thank you, Laura, for the introduction. As Laura mentioned, the conference theme is Communication and Global Human Rights. I would like to make some brief introductory remarks before we go to our conversation. Human rights are the basic rights and freedoms that apply to all people, regardless of the background or belief, based on principles of dignity, equality, and mutual respect. Human rights is a political and a moral language grounded on the notion that all human beings share universal attributes and deserve recognition and support. It is a normative horizon for making our world more humane and just. It is central to the cosmopolitan imagination for which there is a moral and political order above nation states. Human rights are woven into fundamental questions and challenges of our times, such as overlapping crises, including the climate, environmental crisis, health, migration, food insecurity, as well as issues related to global inequalities, conflict, war and peace, and social exclusion and hate. Despite significant progress in the past decades, human rights remain under attack worldwide by a combination of political, economic, technological, and social forces. Digital technologies add further challenges too, such as to the right of privacy, safety, and expression. In this situation, a commitment to a strong global rights framework is more important than ever. Our challenge is deepening human rights advances on multiple fronts while protecting gains from backlash. I would like to offer some personal background on these issues. As we know, scholarship is inevitably biographical. Ideas and interests come from somewhere in our lives. Human rights were central to my upbringing as a person and as a young person with academic plans. I grew up under military dictatorships in Argentina in the 1960s and in the 1970s. And human rights provided my generation with a vocabulary to make sense of the horror of disappearance and murders committed by the regime. Human rights also gave my generation a language to a vision of kind of politics and communication grounded in rights, a language that recognizes the humanity of all human beings as a bedrock principle. That was the time, the 1970s, of the emergence, the consolidation of the human rights movement as a global force in world affairs. Several processes back then contributed to this development, especially information, communication, and journalism trends, such as investigations of human rights abuses, those investigations conducted by reporters, scientists, and civil society organizations, and also a range of activities by social movements to raise awareness, to advocate for rights-based policies and education. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to select the theme for this conference in Australia. Australia is an ideal setting for a conversation about communication and human rights, especially given recent developments. Australia has been a rich laboratory of legislation, initiative, debates, and scholarship on multiple human rights issues. Just to mention a few, the 2023 Australian Indigenous Voice referendum, the 2017 same-sex marriage plebiscite, and debates about issues such as immigration and housing, disability rights, discrimination against transgender people, domestic violence, as well as privacy and surveillance. Today, we have the pleasure to be joined by three remarkable scholars who are deeply engaged with these issues in academia and the public in Australia. Dr. Croucher, Graham, and Dr. Lester, thank you for accepting our invitation. Also, I should thank Dr. Sandra Phillips for putting me in contact with Dr. Graham, and also I would like to thank Dr. Croucher's staff for responding to our invitation. Thank you very much. And now we're going to start the conversation. Let me get my questions here. So, I would like to start with sort of more of a general question, open-ended question for everyone on the panel. What do you think are some of the most remarkable human rights achievements in Australia in the past decade? Whoever wants to take that question first?
No. Well, I'm happy to have a go.
Thank you so much.
But could I, before I answer your question, I'd like to just loop back to a couple of elements that you introduced, Silvio, in your beautiful introduction. And also the fact this is the 74th session that you've done. In your intro of the bio of me, I'm a legal historian, so I get really hung up on all of the backstory of things. And of course it was, last year we celebrated the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And the connection with Australia is really rather special because an Australian was actually in the chair of the General Assembly when that foundational document in our human rights world was adopted. That was Doc Evatt, who is a familiar character to anyone in Australia. And if you go to some of the historical footage of the when it was introduced, you hear that very distinct Australian accent, which I think is also rather lovely to hear. And then you see the indomitable Eleanor Roosevelt, who was the chair of the drafting committee. She also was presenting the document as well. So the resonance to have this conference in Australia just after we've had the 75th anniversary of the Universal Declaration is really special. And I loved the way, Silvio, you spoke of human rights as a language, because that is, for me, that has been a really fundamental idea in the way I've approached the work on human rights in Australia, that it is a language, it is a grammar that provides a way of solving issues, particularly when issues of human rights intersect. But what was magical about human rights and the language of human rights, and it was the big difference in the international discussions at the time, was that it shifted the idea of international discussions on rights as being about nation states and each other. It took it down to a language of rights of individuals. And when that great first article of the Universal Declaration that was reflected in everything you said, Silvio, which was about all human beings are free and equal in dignity and rights, that was the language that you were using in your remarks and that was so strong in your experiences. And in Australia today, so this is getting to the question you actually asked, some of the most notable human rights achievements in Australia, I think it's been incremental in certain areas, like the recognition that we need an e-safety commissioner to deal with issues online, which is essential in the communication world. Modern slavery, the introduction of modern slavery legislation. And this is a kind of yin and yang moment, the recognition that we needed royal commissions on certain really significant issues in aged care, people with disability, and people on social security. Now, that is I suppose it's an achievement. It's a disappointment, but it's also an achievement that we recognise those fundamental human rights challenges and we address them by having a royal commission. It brought to the fore really serious human rights issues. Achievements, there's been significant work in relation to dealing with sexual harassment, particularly in workplaces. So there is a shift in the vocabulary about human rights, but with all achievements, there's so much more to do. So perhaps I'll just leave my long answer there.
Thank you.
Would you like me to jump in here?
Absolutely.
Because Silvia has asked me to sort of focus pretty much on the environment. So in terms of notable achievements in human rights as they relate to the environment over the last decade, the list is pretty short in Australia. I'd put the Climate Change Bill up there of 2022. You know, it's pretty much the first time we've had a coherent climate policy that thinks about the next generation. And, you know, for a lot of you, that may not seem like a big achievement, but in Australia, the context of Australian politics, it is a huge achievement. We've lost, what, 4 prime ministers over climate policy in the last decade alone, and that's you know, really been fuelled also by our very concentrated news landscape that we have here. So really the 2022 bill is just about us meeting our obligations under the Paris Agreement, but the federal opposition is already threatening it to scrap it if it's elected at the next election, which will be in the next 12 months. So, you know, whether it survives or not, you know, I'm not sure if it counts as much of an achievement if it's so tenuous. Mm-hmm. I think the second thing too is probably, and this is something Rosalind will, you know, probably have more to say than me on this, but we've had the first tentative steps in Australia towards recognising the UN resolution that declares access to a clean, healthy and sustainable environment to be a universal human right. The ACT's had a go at bringing that in. That's one of our 8 states and territories. And the ramifications are still pretty unclear, but, you know, so those are the 2 things I'd have on my list.
Thank you. Dr. Graham?
Yeah, could I begin a bit differently about the history of the country? First of all, starting off with the historical note. People may not be aware, and I'm speaking about human rights in a broad sort of way. This modern Australia is about 250 years old, I think about 250. And of course, it was just one of a number of colonised countries around the whole globe, around the world. And while colonialism, the kind of English or Europeans generally, who went to different countries and colonised them, invaded, colonised, took over the resources and so on and so on. They're all different, but one thing seems to be the same everywhere it goes, is that it doesn't end, actually. I've never heard of a country but actually got rid of colonialist ways of governance, of government, of economics, and so on. So Aboriginal people, very similar to Native Americans, Canadians, and so on, rounded up, put onto reserves or reservations, would you call, but also has been a model for other countries, like South Africa, actually. Not good models, because people may not know that the apartheid system actually came from Australia. It actually came from Queensland. Started in about the late 1890s or something like that, and didn't finish until the late 1970s. So generations are under that system, including my mother, but not my father. Some were under that system and some weren't. Anyway, a delegation of South Africa came over to look perhaps around the world, but they found the ideal legislation here in Queensland, took it back over there and called it apartheid, actually. So while it didn't actually begin in South Africa, it started here and was taken up. And similar kind of systems, of course, happened all over the world in colonised countries. But also the idea that colonisation is something of the past is not quite real, not quite true. It started, I don't know, who knows when it started with the doctrine of discovery, I don't know, but it's been going for about 500, maybe 600 centuries. And it is still there, albeit under the guise of other kinds of things like economic systems, global systems, trade, all sorts of ways. The great poverty that is in countries like Australia among Indigenous peoples, but it's matched by around the globe in the global south in different countries there, which have never actually taken control, especially of their economics and as I said, trade and various other government and governance actually too, systems of running their countries and so on. So most of the wealth, great wealth, is still in the north. And until you can talk about all the things that go with that, I think human rights has got a very, very long way to go. Very long way, you know. Sorry, just Sylvia, I have to go to look at how communication is woven into human rights issues. And it's a huge question, but what I say here is I was looking at the agenda, a huge number of ways of looking at communication, technological, I mean, it's unbelievable. But the Socratic method, you know, education, asking questions, answering, and so on and so on. It's extremely important in, you know, education, of course, studies, research, all kinds of intellectual exercises, and so on. And I've been through that, you know, for a number of years. But I actually look also to what you could call a Martin Luther method of straightforward accusatory comments on criticism of the bodies, government, institutions, and so on, all that kind of thing. How you can actually just simply by saying a statement, it is still a question, but it's a statement that finds that institutions and governments find very hard to answer. Institutions like universities and churches and maybe even human rights bodies, you know, to ask those sort of questions. And the main one is, when I can get to it, I'm sorry, Silvio.
Yeah,
I know you said we're going to have a conversation, but we are really, in a way, aren't we? You know. I was giving a talk with some young protesters at the University of Queensland, and they were there, like universities all over the world, especially about Gaza. And one of the things that I was suggesting that they might ask is something really, really basic. Oh God, I'm sorry. Yes. Ask quite pointedly, not necessarily do it in a graffiti, because they might get into trouble, putting it on the great walls of, you know, sandstone universities. Or it could be like billboards, you know, like that movie, Billboards. And the sign would ask, what do you as a learning institution stand for? what ethical standards should a university hold? And then wait for an answer, just wait for an answer. If they answer, they probably don't. And they probably have a very good answers like, well, it's not really up to us about the business going on over there that what is called a war, what I call it's not quite a war, it's about 10 minutes to me. Please, anybody disagree? It's about 10 to 15 minutes of war, and the rest is an extermination program, basically. So it's not really war for me. And I can talk about that in the history of this country, because a lot of Aboriginal people know very well what those things are: extermination, genocide, and so on and so on. So the slaughtering part of colonialism might be not here and now, but there are still deaths in custody. So there are, every now and then, a death occurs, what I've taken to calling murders of Aboriginal people by the state. The state kills Aboriginal people in this country, and nobody is ever held accountable. And nobody ever seems to talk about that in terms of human rights, actually. Not many, anyway. So, and it continues. But there is a place on that other side of the world that is, oddly enough, an old colonial kind of system of slaughtering the Indigenous in huge numbers that is still going on in this year, in the year of 2024. So it just makes you wonder about huge questions like that, about, well, what is it that all these institutions, like the UN itself actually, too, what do they actually stand for, if not by doing things? Because it strikes me that, has always struck me, and this is in our old system of our own ancient system, and a short description I meant to give, our system is a sacralised, ecological, collaborative, self-regulating stewardship system. It's not a religion or not even a philosophy or an ideology. It might be a philosophy in the sense of, if anybody speaks German here, there's a word called Weltanschauung. It means a worldview, and that's what we have. It's not a religion or anything like that, but it is the way of doing stewardship, not believing in it or having it as a high ideal like an ethic. It's not an ethic, it's an actual practical action thing, which builds up a sense of what you could call a conscience that is embedded in the whole population of a country. It's embedded. Sorry.
I want to follow up. There's several points that you mentioned that I want to follow up with the conversation. One was, and you mentioned sort of what in your mind, I'm asking everybody here a question, some of the main challenges that we have in this country around human rights, and Dr. Graham already mentioned a few. Dr. Croucher or Dr. Lester, would like to?
Oh, well, there are many challenges. Our incomplete conversation recognising our First Nations. We had an attempt at a referendum to embed a mechanism of voice in our constitution that failed. And while 40% of the country supported it, 60% did not. And while the referendum failed, the obligation to listen does not stop. That is a challenge, finding the way to listen. And I want to link that to a wider idea in terms of not being complacent, because complacency is the enemy of real progress. And we have many incomplete aspects of protection of human rights in Australia. The Human Rights Commission has just completed a major body of work where we've advocated for In particular, bringing rights home. I spoke in glowing terms about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, but we never brought them home. We do not have a Human Rights Act at the federal level in this country. It sits out there in the vibe, but it's not part of our bedrock of right in our law. It is a fundamental missing piece, and the model that we've advocated does have a right to a healthy environment. It's part of the work that we've advanced. So it's a big challenge to get the work that we've just completed through. It's a big challenge to complete the embedding of a proper relationship with our First Nations people. And I want to take that idea of respect one step further, and it's playing out in different ways in the challenges we've seen on university campuses, in exercising rights to protest and using one's communication in a range of ways. And we spoke of respect, Silvio, and I speak of respect as that active voice of dignity, but there's another word that we need in our challenging times, and it's more than respect, it's empathy. Because empathy is a quality of understanding. It's where you see the common humanity, and it's much more than respect. It has a much deeper resonance. And to me, it's the challenge in the human rights context to build that sense of dignity is founded on respect, and respect, to make it real, requires true empathy. So the work that we're doing in terms of law reform and building a new racism framework or anti-racism framework, all of those are mechanisms, but they're mechanisms that fundamentally start with respect, dignity, and empathy.
And I'll pick up on something that both Mary and Rosalind have mentioned, which is protest and being heard within a respectful way. One of the biggest challenges I think that's happening in Australia right now in terms of human rights is the anti-protest laws that are being introduced by many of our states. I think it's 5 out of 8 states have introduced much tougher penalties for protest over the last 2 years. I mean, as an example, South Australia's lifted its maximum fine from $750 to $50,000 and potential jail time. And that was rushed through after protesters disrupted an oil and gas conference. In New South Wales, where fines have gone up to $22,000, and those laws specifically target protesters who block ports or roads to ports. So it's about fossil fuels. In Victoria, anti-logging protesters who hinder, obstruct or interfere with timber harvesting operations can face up to 12 months in prison. In Queensland, you don't want to get caught with a bike lock, because that's otherwise known as now as a dangerous attachment device, and you could get 2 years imprisonment for that. And in Tasmania, my home state, you know, environmental protest is part of our DNA. You know, we're the home of the world's first Green Party. We've been at it pretty constantly for 50 years. But right now we've got an anti-logging protester. This is just somebody who wants to protect forests, has just come out from, I think, 3 or 4 month jails they served. There's another 60 people waiting trial for it. And this is, their crime is for interfering with lawful work. And so lawful work in this case is logging of forests, you know, in this day and age, native forests, which is exempt, so that allows the logging to take place. We've got they're trying to protect 2 critically endangered bird species. So to me, I think that trend that I know is happening in probably many of your countries as well, is a real danger. And I think from a communications perspective or communications research perspective, you know, we've often thought about, you know, the right to voice and the use of protest as a way of voice, you know, getting into the public arena. I think this is now about kind of blowing up the public arena itself. So.
Well, we're in a situation right now that I predicted, which I don't know what question to ask first because I have so many questions. So let me try this. Dr. Graham, you have this wonderful phrase that I heard that you said in an interview. You said, "I'm located, therefore I am," as you describe relationality and your argument that everything starts with land. How do you connect relationality with human rights? The idea that human rights uses a universal language and the promise of human rights, it is a global promise. How is it connected to question of location and difference?
Well, I guess it goes back to that saying there before that I read out, that across the country, when, as elderly Aboriginal people, quite often, what I grew up with, hearing them say that the land grew us up, it invented us. It's the odd thing, actually. It's not totally against the science that says that the land has invented us. The big difference is that Aboriginal people, like most Indigenous people around the world, and very old cultures, is that it's a sacralised thing. It's a sacralised process. It's not just pure science, pure material, physical, something like that. So a reciprocity, a system of reciprocity happens. It goes like that. It's invented us. It continues to look after us, keep us alive. If it wasn't there, we'd be floating in space, probably. So we're obliged forever, this obligation never goes away, to look after it back. That's it. And that is embedded in someone. So, for example, I also work with the philosophy, School of Philosophy in UQ, University of Queensland. And they're all for having philosophy in schools, which I totally agree with. I think every state school should have a required in the curriculum to learn philosophy. First of all, their own, Western philosophy, Aboriginal ideas, the idea of our philosophy, or Welton Shawng, if you like, and also Asian philosophy too, something that tells and that young Australians learn what neighbourhood this country is placed in, you know, so that they get to accept it and understand it and so on. So you've got to have the three. But the one thing that I couldn't understand when I was thinking about school philosophy in schools is because they see it as, what do they call, analytical philosophy. And I could understand continental philosophy, because there's such a place as the continent, you know, a big continent full of Europeans. It's called Europe because it's full of Europeans, all with their different cultures and languages and so on, just like Australia, you know. But the whole place is a continent. Geographically, you could see it from the spaceship and all that kind of stuff. But analytical philosophy, I never did get that because it didn't seem to have a place. Where does it come from? How does it come from? Everything enters the world. You know, every living thing enters the world, and there's a whole stories about it. And old cultures like Greece, Rome, all of Asia, all of Africa, they all have stories about how things come into the world. Even propositions come into the world, and so on. So it's extremely important to. That place precedes inquiry. Place will tell you that'll fill you in about inquiry and so on. You know? So that's what I'd like to see happening in Australian schools. You know, Europe has a history of teaching philosophy in schools, from what I gather. You know, which I think is wonderful. You know, but you'd find out a lot more if you know the Australian education system was a bit more modern in that way.
Thank you. If you have any questions, please send them on the app. You will find on this session a live section where you can send your questions. Let me put my phone out here. So. Next, I have a question for Dr. Croucher. You have said that Australia has changed significantly over the last 25 years in terms of population, economy, culture, and the impact of technology, but the laws, policies, and practices which make up Australia's human rights framework have not kept pace. How do you explain the situation? I'm sure, what are the places to think about in terms of explaining this gap that you identify?
I use the word complacency. I think that's part of it. It's this sense of everything's fine. You know, there's this commitment to the idea of a fair go and all the rest. That's fine in a closed circle. Once you start to see beyond the edges of that self-referential closed circle, you start to see the people who are invisible, the people who don't have a voice. And that's the dynamic of all of that became really clear during a conference we held a couple of weeks ago. And it was a continuous theme where the sense that parliaments are great for majorities. Parliaments are terrific for majorities, but it's the others, the minorities that remain on the edges, people with disability, many First Nations people, people from culturally and racially marginalised backgrounds, LGBTIQA plus people who've needed the law to become their allies, but the law as enacted through our parliaments has been an inwardly referencing circle. And there was a young disability activist and writer, Hannah Diviney, who explained so beautifully at our conference why we need to have a Human Rights Act as part of the fabric, both at state and territory level and federally, to give tools and leverage that enables challenges to the kinds of laws that Dr. Lester was talking about, challenges to when our First Nations voices are ignored, the tools to achieve that. What Hannah Diviney said was that the little people, and she was referring to herself in that sense, the little people need a Human Rights Act and the tools it brings so the big people can fight. The big people, the community groups, the activists, the advocates, the NGOs, but without the tools, and the tools come from parliaments, and our parliaments have been great for the majority, but they've ignored the minorities. And we're finally breaking through that in a revived conversation about those missing pieces. And it can't come soon enough. There's winds in the sails of possibility right now. I referred to the work that we've completed as the Human Rights Commission, the National Human Rights Institution. We've done this report, which is aspirationally a contribution by us. But it has aligned with an important report of a parliamentary committee, and it's aligned with the Disability Royal Commission. So it's not just us paddling our own canoe off on the side, but this alignment across various big bodies of work that says we need the tools so that the big people can fight for the little people. And those tools have got to be embedded through a parliament, not self-referencing, but speaking for those whose voices have otherwise gone unheard.
Thank you. I would like to build off the question of the need for a Human Rights Act. This is a question for Dr. Lester. One argument that has been made in Australia, but elsewhere as well, is that the need for a National Human Rights Act is to foster a rights-respecting culture. In your experience, Dr. Lester, how do you build, how you foster a rights culture around, particularly, let's say, environmental issues, but we can talk about other set of rights. And of course, what communication has to do with sort of fostering a right-based culture.
Journalism, I'd say. You know, I think I'm not alone in missing local journalism, and particularly about those. So I'm trying to find another way of saying it, apart from little voices. But you know, those marginalised voices in regional Australia, I think, is really important. Shared public spaces, you know, where these things are actually aired. I think taking our international obligations seriously, which we haven't always been great at in Australia. We you know, very good, and maybe it's because we're an island continent, we're very good at just shutting down the borders when it suits us in terms of what those obligations, what we've signed up to do. Respect, I'd have in there, and information. So I think, you know, you know, again, thinking about environment, and particularly around that land use change anxiety that is coming at us in Australia. You know, we've got probably the biggest transition. I don't want to overstate it, but I'm quoting Alan Finkel, who was the former chief scientist for Australia. This is the biggest change in human history that's coming at us over the next decade. We have to change the way we do pretty much, you know, run our lives in Australia in particular, because we have been the biggest emitter per capita of greenhouse gases. So the change, we've got a big change to make from a pretty poor starting point. And I think, you know, that you know, we as communications scholars have a really significant role in this. And we've allowed ourselves to be a bit marginalised in it. Science has kind of diagnosed the problem. We've got technology you know, really kind of pointing out where we need to go and what we need to do. But the thing is, we're only going to get through this if we see this as a social problem, and with communications at the core of it. And the other thing I'd add there is that we just don't have adequate social data. We just don't know how people are tracking, you know, nor are we asking enough of what they want, and we're not defining communities well. You know, we allow our definition of community, quite rightly, I think, to expand and come back, depending on whether we're dealing with a transnational kind of issue or a World Heritage issue, or whether it's about the local place. You know, we've got to kind of really, I think we've got so much to offer as a group in what's coming at us. Hasn't really answered your question, but...
Any thoughts on that, Dr. Graham and Dr. Croucher, on the question of what to do? I mean, to me, it's not only a question of fostering a right-based culture, but how to do it in the current situation in which not necessarily there's an agreement on the, let's say, on the basic communication principles, on shared ideas or shared norms, to have a conversation about these issues. Before we get into human rights, what are the minimal sort of communication conditions that may not exist in a situation of, again, polarization, exacerbation, dehumanization, lack of empathy, back to the point you mentioned earlier. Are there specific examples in Australia that show that it's possible to bridge those differences, to have, you know, minimal agreements around human rights issues?
If I may, absolutely. I think one of the beauties of a human rights instrument, a statute, is it provides the basis upon which you can develop that grammar, the language of human rights, the tools of human rights. And when there is an obligation on the public sector, so government people, to take rights seriously, that it's built in as part of their obligations, part of their duties, their way of working, then you can build the culture around that. In Victoria, which was has had a Charter of Rights and Responsibilities, that's the name of their legislation, for quite some time now. One of the key things that has achieved is a shift in that culture of understanding in the public sector. The man, Rob Hulls, who was the man who introduced from the Parliament in Victoria that statute, said that was the key thing that piece of legislation did. It worked to change the culture of the public service. And that culture is what I've described as rights-mindedness. But it has to start with that common grammar. And if you don't have that common grammar, that common language, that common expectations, then you waffle around in other language like the fair go, and which is fine, but unless there is an obligation with real meaning, and in human rights terms, that is that you make sure that the relevant people affected are consulted, that the purpose of the thing you want to do is a legitimate one, that whatever solution you're developing that might have an impact on rights is the least restrictive option and for the least possible time. It's a familiar equation, if you like, in navigating difficult issues, but unless you have that common grammar, you don't, and an obligation to go with it. So it's the two things, the duty on the public sector, the duty and the language. The two go hand in hand, and then you can make advancements, you can lift. And if I can just loop into one thing, the Royal Commission that dealt with the thing that's been described in Australia as robo-debt, where there was an idea, and it brought in one of these other tropes that is so evil, the trope of the dole bludger, which is someone who is utilising utilising social security because they fundamentally don't deserve it. It's a really negative categorisation of people who are welfare recipients because there is a human right to social security after all. But it was an automated debt recovery system that was completely flawed, and it led to targeting incredibly vulnerable people who were welfare dependent, with generating all of these dreadful debts. And it led some people suicided. It was just horrendous. A really bad policy, no human rights at its core, and it led to a Royal Commission. And the Royal Commissioner, who was previously the head of the Supreme Court in Queensland, Catherine Holmes, she said, a change in culture is what is necessary to change the outcomes that we have seen. And for us, as the Human Rights Commission, and in advocating for a Human Rights Act, it places at its core that change in culture. So we've got the Royal Commissioner saying the same thing, and we've suggested some of the tools that might help to navigate that. And one of the elements of our model, Dr. Graham, is that it includes a duty, a participation duty. It includes the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and the obligation to consult, the obligation in terms of self-determined decisions. It factors that into the design of our building of rights-mindedness as well.
And of course, truth-telling, which we haven't had a formal process of in Australia, may also would also support that.
Yeah.
And
Do you mind elaborating further on the question of truth-telling as essential?
Sorry, I was just going to add one thing. Forgive me for cutting over you, Silvio. But the idea of truth-telling is such a resonant one because when the Western system of law ends up with a Royal Commission, you know things have got pretty bad. But what Royal Commissions are is a mechanism of truth-telling. And what those truth-telling processes brought out was that for people with disability, people as welfare recipients, and people in aged care, there was some pretty terrible stuff going on. But a Royal Commission is a bad way to manage human rights. You've got to flip it right around based on your culture of rights-mindedness and start to shift that deeper understanding, out of which maybe we get true empathy.
Well, the deaths in custody, you know, the terms of reference of that, they didn't seem to, hadn't seemed to take any notice of that. The outcomes of it, what is it, about 90 or nearly 100 recommendations? I think 3 have been done, completed. You know, 3 out of nearly 100 and so on. But what I wanted to talk about though too was just the idea of rights. You know, it's mainly obligations for Aboriginal people. I often wondered when I was younger why people didn't fight for the obligations, fight from that point of view. And I learnt from my very good friend, Dr. Irene Watson. She's from South Australia University, a law professor. She knows Aboriginal law and Western law very, very well. It was just how it worked out in that way, that Western law is, you know, the kingpin in the globe, really. But anyway, it made me wonder, 10 to 12,000 years ago, the idea of people fighting over who owns and controls all the resources in the world. You know, it starts off in a region, then it goes to different regions, and now it's sort of like a global thing, you know, fighting for the rights of certain countries that they can do that, you know. And it takes it further. The idea of rights then becomes a competing thing, you know, just straight competing over whose rights count, really, you know, and so on. I just can't understand that. I still can't understand it, how all these wonderful philosophies and everything can be written, but people still come back to competing over rights, you know. And of course, Indigenous people, their rights quite often are on the bottom of the rung, you know, about anything, you know, about a whole range of things, of course. But yeah, I just wanted to say that, really. How on earth do you get past that? Because rights are seen as a good thing too, aren't they, you know? Somebody fighting for the rights of this and fighting for the rights of that, and until it sort of comes up slam dunk against another and somebody else's rights, you know. So it's competition. It doesn't seem to going anywhere, you know, to get to the end of that, to solve that contradiction. You know?
Thank you.
How do you do that?
I want to pick on something that you mentioned earlier, the question of the worldview. And this is a question probably for Dr. Lester before we go to questions from the audience. The question is, let me just read what I have here. Many scholars, policymakers, and activists claim that environmental rights demands a major philosophical transformation away from anthropocentrism, right? Turning upside down the dominant paradigm of economic rationality, growth, and progress. Can you talk about sort of this sort of clashes between different worldviews, how it's happening in Australia in terms of thinking about shifting the paradigm around environmental rights, or what does it mean? Sort of these old notions about relationship between humans and the environment. Have these more, let's say, alternative perspectives gain ground in Australia? Where? How?
I think there are kind of, you know, there's the informal background noise here about where even just a focus on the environment has sat within the Australian kind of psyche. You know, to care about trees and the environment, I think in the 250 years since colonisation, was seen as a little bit, you know, kind of almost a little bit unmanly, really, you know, in the Australian context. I think, you know, a lot of those of us who worked in that area in terms of covering, you know, certainly as a journalist, covering the environment, I copped it many times, you know, in terms of that sense of the issues being marginalised, you know, because clearly it wasn't as important as economics or politics or policy or international relations or industrial relations, you know. And, you know, I think, you know, I've also had that issue in terms of my own research funding, where the Federal Minister actually, you know, decided to knock off an Australian Research Council grant, you know, and use his ministerial discretion because we happen to be mentioning the environment and, you know, and sport in it. And I think his quote was something like, you know, the Australian people wouldn't want us to be using our money on something so irrelevant. And I was just, you know, listening to a story yesterday about Paris and how they're going to have to put all the athletes in ice baths constantly to keep them cool enough. And I think, you know, that's going to cost them 1,000 times more than our research grant would have. But, it, you know, everything we do has to be in Australia. So it is a massive cultural change. It's not just about actually, how do we move on beyond the GDP? Right. So, but having said that, I think and we're working sort of in the area of sort of this notion of a well-being lens. And, you know, quite a few countries now have adopted that, so that all their policies are being run through a particular lens that really picks up on the key domains of life. I think the OECD one has about 11 or something. There's about 10 or 12 countries that are doing that now. I don't know. I'm just not. I'm not hopeful. I'm not hopeful because of that cultural problem that sits behind. The other thing that makes me really unhopeful about it is the international finance system. You know, we once complained about science as being needing to sort of be translated for us. International finance is a language that I just simply do not understand. You know, I was at a thing last week around the renewables rollout and the transition to net zero. It's with a lot of people who are both, you know, at the forefront of developing the technologies and science, etc. The finance guys got up and talked. None of us had a clue what they were talking about. Right. You know, once we'd gone through all the acronyms and, you know, yes, VC's venture capital and blah, blah, blah. But that's been unleashed on us since Paris. And as we go through this transition period, you know, that I think we have to work very hard to both understand what is being done to us and the lens through which it's being done, right. Which is so, to me, just very unclear.
Right. Let me add another further complicated question here, coming from a member of the audience. We already talked about the role of empathy in human rights, and the question is, what do you think should be the way forward to inculcate in minds of younger people a question of empathy? I think several of us are thinking about how you foster empathy in a world in which there are plenty of signs in the opposite direction, right? How do you cultivate that communication disposition about understanding, put yourself in the shoes of somebody else? Without that, it's difficult to think about human rights as something that transcend, that sort of bring us all together, right? Well, Dr. Croucher, I think that you want to say.
I think there are lots of answers. I think Dr. Graham introduced the idea of philosophy with children. It starts early, and why this idea of empathy became so pressed on my mind lately is the tensions that are being brought out in Australia today. That are, you know, people. When people turn on each other for reasons that aren't connected with here, but connected with other places, when people bring trauma with them, and that plays out in ways that are disrespectful and lose empathy. It just has been something I've been really mulling over so strongly in recent months. But in terms of how you navigate it forward, education is one major aspect to it, and from the beginning with little ones. And sport. Sport is a wonderful place for building empathy. And also the work that my colleagues are doing. I draw attention in particular to the work of the Race Discrimination Commissioner, Giri Sivaraman, who is working on an anti-racism framework. And it's that particular language, but it is essentially how you build from listening to communities and in a way that provides government responses and actions that can start to build in the mechanisms for what I've just described in very broad brush terms, but as the thing we want to get to, which is beyond division, beyond othering and beyond disrespect, to a place which is respectful and empathetic based on our common humanity.
And could I add there, I actually don't think banning under 16-year-olds from social media is going to be the solution.
Banning usually isn't the way to solve any problem.
And you know, it seems to me that we have this kind of extraordinary tool that has the potential to communicate empathy. And you know, it seems easier to just vacate the field to it being a place of bullying and despair and all these other things, rather than us getting in there and trying to support it becoming a place of empathy.
Could I say, it's hard to talk about it in a present way because, as we were saying before, you know, it's a really old culture, and even though huge changes brought, our colonialism brought all these huge changes, we've been influenced, very influenced by Western culture, of course, like everybody in the world and so on. But there are still particular values that are there and different ways of thinking and so on. And we have our own logic, a particular logic, so we don't have our Aristotelian logic. Aboriginal people, they understand it, but it's not at all like that. It's, without going too much into it, it's essentially all perspectives are valid and reasonable, really. So everybody is autonomous across the whole country. Every different group is autonomous. There's no hierarchy, there's no central idea of thinking, there's no state, or there's no powerful force that dominates everybody else. So you are autonomous in your clan, our clans, various groups, and you as a person, an individual, you're an autonomous being. And the way you, the system that was worked out, the governance system, but also the social system, is one of autonomous regard. It's a little bit like mutual respect, but it's autonomous regard. It's a bit harder, more firmer, do you know? So you know the other person is autonomous also. It's not the kind of autonomy that says you are a law unto yourself. Not at all, absolutely not. It's you're full of obligations, and it's true, you know, via relatives and friends and family and so on and so on. But you're obligated to neighbours, to all kinds of things, you know. So it's ancient and it's built in. It's an old system that's been built in. So you learn empathy anyway. You know, you just simply, it comes as you're growing up. All sorts of ways. There are words that you can use in different languages that triggers sympathy straight away. You say this word and it triggers empathy, but also sympathy though too. And sometimes I've heard people say a particular word and somebody's, you know, your tears will spring to your eyes straight away. You can call it mind control or something, but it's so ancient, you know, it's so old. You're supposed to do this, you see. And you add that kind of social system together with the total absence of wars of conquest, in other words, no invasion, lots of fighting, but no invasion, classic invasion, taking over someone else's country. That was totally incomprehensible for Aboriginal people to understand when Europeans came in. Somebody takes over someone else's country, you know. But all that sympathy, empathy is just sort of all built in. So it's where the logic is closer to, I'd say, Chinese or Asian logic. Do you know? It's from what I've learnt of those other kind of logics or philosophy, they accept paradoxes, contradictions, ambiguity, ambivalence, and I know most non-Western people know that the West, Europeans, they have to have certainty, absolutely have to. Most of the people in the world know the world is full of uncertainty, actually, so you have to try and understand it better. You understand it and go with it, you know. Some make arrangements and, you know, live with it, basically, you know, and so on. So it's just a whole different old culture, and it has been damaged, definitely has, you know, all kinds of ways. But it's still there, it hangs on, because it's very hard to change your way of thinking, eh, you know.
Thank you. We have a few minutes left. I wanted to fold some of the questions into questions from you into questions that I just asked. But just to close, I would like to ask you the following question. Oftentimes, and it's something that Dr. Lester mentioned, when we talk about the challenges and the problems around human rights, it's easy to feel despair about it. My question is pretty much the opposite. What gives you hope? What gives you inspiration? If you can talk about, let's say, for 1 minute each person, then hopefully that's enough time, although hopefully it will be more than that. So what gives you hope in spite of all the challenges that we have discussed yet? Dr. Lester, you want to start?
What gives me hope? That I have been thinking, writing, working in the area of climate change for 35 years, 36 years. When I was a young journalist and the Brundtland report came out and we talked about sustainable development, I couldn't for the life of me get the word sustainable into the newspaper. I was an environment reporter. I just couldn't get it past the editors. And so one night at the pub, I had a bet with some mates that we could get the most obscure word we could think of in the English language into the paper before we could get the word sustainable and sustainability. We chose Spondylix, which means small change. We all got Spondylix into the paper in the next 2 days. Now, you know, so, you know, somebody said to me, you know, what have you been doing with your life the other night? And, you know, they sort of said, well, you failed, haven't you, if you've been trying to do climate change and look at the state of the world. But never, you know, in all those years has it been so much on the agenda. There's just so much action. And I think we're getting it, you know, I just, you know, the critical minerals thing, I just think, oh my God, what's going to happen, you know, to the world as we battle that one out. But at least we're starting to think about the world and and sustainability and the next generations.
Thank you. Dr. Croucher, what gives you hope?
Me?
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. The children.
Yeah?
Yeah, the children. The faces of the little ones. If I may, I'd like to share, there's the last stanza of a poem by First Nations poet Udjuru Nunako, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Social Justice Commissioner Mick Gooder introduced me to this poem, and it's one that does give me hope. It's called A Song of Hope, and the last stanza goes like this. To our fathers' fathers, the pain, the sorrow. To our children's children, the glad tomorrow.
I know that one, yes.
The Song of Hope.
Yes.
So it's the little ones.
It's there.
Our kids, my grandchildren, the little ones, they give me hope.
Thank you. Dr. Graham?
I'd like to say what gives me hope is young people, especially all the ones that are protesting. I thought, gee, it's almost as if they sort of somehow learnt and know what ethics are, more so than their adults, actually, you know, because they're out there. Because obviously, being Aboriginal people, we're very sympathetic and empathetic, of course, with the Palestinians, because we see them and we see our own history, you know, that's going on. The other thing, sorry, just to, and I know they're getting it hard, being criticised all over the place and so on. I think they have intentions of carrying on. Their last one is the title of some political movements in Africa. I forget the country, but they called the title of their paper, I think it was, Adieu Coloniser. Adieu Coloniser. I'd like to add Adieu Hegemon to that one. And I'd also like to say welcome, a big welcome to global multipolarity, because that will be a great leap for in communication eventually, after the shock gets over of multipolarity, you know, in communicating. You'll communicate properly. In a sense, that's the, I like multipolarity because if you see our system on a map, it's actually multipolarity in one country. That's what it is. And they worked out not looking for security, but looking for stability. And stability is the pathway to security, a stable system. And it starts with land, actually. Look after land. And there's an old saying, look after country, look after kin. It's all over the whole country. Everybody knows that, out of the English, you know. Look after country, look after kin. Country comes first and then kin, that is all the population, basically, you know. Because you know then how to look after the people by looking after land first. So it's a template, basically, a blueprint for a stable society for eons of time. You know?
Thank you very much.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we run out of time. Thank you, Dr. Graham, Dr. Croucher, Dr. Lester. It was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you.
Thank you for your time and for coming here. Thank you, everybody. I wish you a productive conference. And now we're going to the reception. So I'm standing in between you and food and drink, so I better get out of here. Thank you so much.